I love that it asks permission now. Change.
I learned, you gotta do that.
Alrighty.
Yeah.
Okay. We all good to go?
Yeah, you're good to go.
Yes, sir. We're good to go.
All right. So, hi, everybody. I am Jerome Haferd. And I've kind of been listening in. So, actually, I see a few familiar faces here. And I thought today I would do a little bit of a talk to kind of give some insight into some work of my architecture practice right now, diving a little bit deeper into one project in particular, which is an ongoing project that you see on the left. But hopefully giving, just a little bit more of building more of a picture of, what practice can look like. I think you guys are getting a sort of diverse set of viewpoints and experiences. And as I mentioned, if you remembered my short talk, my trajectory sort of went through a bachelor's of science in architecture, then a master's of architecture, and then went to work for a firm, a kind of, international design firm for several years, during which I got licensed as a licensed architect. So I have that credential. And then eventually decided to start my own practice, which has really been going officially as a practice for about 3 years. But in some ways, you could say significantly longer, because I've been working with my business partner on projects for significantly longer, maybe you could say even 10 years. So architecture is a long game, and it's a long field. Often young architects are still considered young, even into their 40s and 50s to some degree. And I think some of that has to do with the amount of school and education that it takes, and training. And the sheer amount of things that we need to know in a way. In a way, it's a life. I mean, any profession, any discipline, I think, is a lifelong learning process. And I think that, at least architecture, kind of capital A, that is buildings, and the built environment, especially when you get into things like master plans and urban plans, can take many years to realize from start to finish. And so, architects might be involved at any given time in a number of projects that might be at many different points of their process, of their life cycle. So I'm involved in projects now that are at the very beginning. I'm involved in some projects now that, have been going on for years, that might be entering construction. There's some projects that would be in the design phase that exist on paper, and in drawings, which is really our kind of classic output phase as architects. We produce the drawings that then get realized by the construction fields. And then, if you're around long enough, you start to see projects get completed. So it's a long practice. And also, if you strike out on your own, getting to the point where you are, producing work that is at a certain scale is also a kind of a process for most firms, depending on how they start. No two firms start the same way. So in a way, I'll be taking you through a little bit of a process of kind of how my practice is moving from, say, smaller scale built work, and beginning to make that step into a sort of larger scale of work, and what that looks like for our practice in particular. So my practice is called Brandt Haferd. I keep going here. Oh, that's us. And that's really the combination of two names of my business partner and myself, her first name and my last name. And so that's us. We are a partnership. Our practice legally is a design professional corporation, which there's many different types that of legal entity that you can be. And a design professional corporation is actually a relatively new one, but you need a licensed individual to form that entity, which we did. And the title of the talk has to do with sort of some issues that we became interested in even pre-COVID, but now are kind of really even amplified by things like COVID and where we find ourselves. So we've been really interested in this idea of how do you undesign isolation, and isolation in different forms relating to accessibility and its different forms. You know, accessibility, say, for alternate abled persons, or you could say disabled persons, accessibility of different people into architecture, and the accessibility of architecture, which can be at times a very alienating discourse to sort of non-architects because of how sort of advanced and esoteric the field can seem. So different types of accessibility, and also just different ways to produce community. And how that might relate to equity as well in our field, which has come up a lot, like in Killian's presentation. And so these are some things that as a small practice, we're just like, okay, what are we interested in? And so where I think that comes into play in both at the urban scale and some of these buildings that we are designing is in a couple different ways. And one of those is this issue of the public and private, and how architecture begins to deal with that issue, which is an issue that comes up a lot in architecture and urban design. And then this issue of sort of territory and ownership, of how, you know, which is very related to public and private, but how we might learn to share different things, share territory, share spaces, and even share ownership through architecture as the kind of medium of that. And so as I was telling you guys, we started out really building these public art projects, not unlike Jennifer's practice. These ones are made out of wood, though I think her practice is our steel specialists. Which in and of itself is actually a little bit unusual for a New York practice to be building stuff in public space, just because space is at such a premium in New York City. We were lucky to kind of have opportunities to build things in public space that actually became activated by people, and, you know, got a real intimate connection with materials, with construction techniques. As a lot of these projects, this was actually a competition for young designers to submit a design, which you could see would have looked maybe in drawing form, like the drawings on the left, for a pavilion in a public park in Queens. And if you won, you got to build it yourself. So we really sort of started to learn and get better at making certain details in our practice by having to figure them out, building some of these pavilion projects in the city, which then actual people got to enjoy, which was really satisfying for a young practice. And here's a couple more of those. This one is in Harlem, very near where I live. And so there was a real connection to some of these places that we were building these public art projects. This one is actually made out of steel that's welded primarily. So it's a lot like one of Jennifer's in some ways. And so, you know, this is at a kind of human scale. This piece, I just brought this up because this piece really dealt with African-American history and culture. We, you know, collaborated with a media sound artist in the case of this piece, which was a really innovative use of material, who decided to use the steel of this piece to program it to vibrate with sound, exactly like the headphone of your headset would work with a transducer, so that it would play these speeches that were kind of important Black history speeches in this space in Harlem. But so we kind of then even, you know, looking at the sort of drawings that we would make, we started getting asked to do all sorts of different pavilions and wondering, okay, so this is one way to activate public space by, you know, kind of entering these sorts of competitions that are for these temporary buildings, you could say, temporary structures made out of all different sorts of materials. In this case, this one was made out of wood, but a kind of heavy timber project. Thinking about how do you, you know, maybe make something that's typically very light, like a pavilion, actually be very heavy, and kind of experiment with a technology that is really normally used in sort of heavy, you know, durable, very long-lasting buildings. And how, and you know, thinking about how to mix people up in some of these spaces, whatever it is that we're designing. So this is an ongoing project, which is actually my own studio space. So if you're starting out, you know, one of the things you might get asked to do is something that you're, you know, someone you know needs help with. So this is the owner of the building that we have our office in said, hey, can you guys design and renovate our entire building, starting with your own space? So, you know, really the sorts of projects that you get if you're just starting out are going to be a lot having to do with the network that you have, in this case in New York City. But anyway, really thinking about how, for example, in the space of a single building or single project, beginning with these very small temporary projects, people can begin to share space or share different infrastructure of the building, different amenities, like you see tables being used in this space, you see fabrication equipment being used by a community inside of this building. And we've been very interested in how, you know, architecture can actually help to facilitate that process. How you design the spaces of a building and lay them out can aid in producing a different kind of community inside of that building, based on how you might lay out the rooms and so on and so forth, which I'll get into later in more detail in a specific project. And, you know, again, thinking about territory and ownership and some more experimental work that we've done in the office that really starts to, you know, literally just aesthetically blur boundaries and figure out, you know, okay, can two different people work on the same drawing at the same time? Can two different people, you know, like a game of Twister, occupy the same space at the same time? Or in this case of a neighborhood that I'm still currently working with here north of New York City, can different neighbors sort of occupy and share even their backyards in a different way? So this is an idea that, you know, can play out at different scales. It can play out at the scale of a small pavilion. It can play out at the scale of a building with many floors. It can play out here at the scale of a neighborhood where you might have different single family homes sharing a yard or sharing property and reconsidering how they might organize or even construct buildings in their community spaces, in this case, in their backyards, that would have a different kind of relationship to the individual lots. And so I did a studio. This is some graduate students who began to use some of these construction techniques I'm talking about, like the stick frame, which is the light frame way to construct a house, and experimenting with that idea of, okay, are there different ways to build with maybe a stick frame construction? So you see a kind of X-ray view into the house here in the framing diagram, in ways that you can kind of hack that system and produce like larger spaces inside this kind of communal house. Or, you know, how does the architecture begin to respond if we begin to combine our backyards? In this case, this is an African burial ground site that was discovered in the backyards of these neighbors in a small city called Kingston, New York, which really caused the community to rethink how do we reconsider this my backyard, which connects to all of my other neighbors' backyard, now that we are almost treating this like a memorial space or a new kind of community space. So that I believe can feed back into even how we construct the architecture that might surround that site. So this is some student work, which really took that on and thinking about, again, construction and architecture, materials, and how we might begin to think to allow those systems to respond to this situation or to this kind of new added layer to even a very sort of mundane situation that, you know, just people's yards becomes a community space. And it reminds us of projects like this one done by a colleague of ours, Mitch McEwen, where she took this, in this case, it's called a balloon frame, or the kind of stick frame construction of a house in Detroit, and kind of creatively subtracted from that construction system, again, at the scale of the single house, to create a large community space, which they called House Opera. And you can see a kind of working drawing, maybe that was a sort of site sketch, working sketch, construction drawing on the right, where they began to just delete the you know, framing members where you can, to kind of hack that system. A very common system. This is how millions of houses across the United States are built. And so this is, again, another project that's ongoing, where the community is seeking to do a sort of similar thing inside this house adjacent to this African burial ground. So what we decided to do was, in our office, look at 3 different projects that we felt were addressing this idea of social isolation at 3 different scales. And the first scale, kind of going down, starting at the big picture and going down to the smaller scale. So beginning at the urban scale, we did this kind of, and then to the neighborhood scale and the domestic scale. But beginning at the urban scale, we did this sort of just fantastical, you know, project that was just a series of drawings that began to look at these spaces in New York City that are called privately owned public spaces. And many of them exist outside of very famous buildings, but they're all kind of fragmented, and some of them are used better than others. And especially now that downtown Manhattan has become a very different place. But even before that, we began to think, okay, some of these places don't really work so well. And how might you at the urban scale begin to, use our capacity as architects to just draw up a different future? So this is a very quick project that then becomes more, I think, meaningful when we see things like Black Lives Matter protests happening and the city being re-energized and these public spaces being stitched together in new ways with the lack of, say, vehicular traffic downtown, the influx of people using the sort of commercial environment very differently. For example, here in this restaurant project that I'm working on, where the restaurants are beginning to spill out into the street. So the entire public realm has begun to change in a place like New York City, and probably where you guys live as well, as a response to something like COVID, which really, I think, is tapping into a desire that many of the residents of a place like New York already had for this environment to become more user-friendly. And so we produced a sort of analysis of these public spaces and isolated a lot of them and sort of analyzed them, where they were, how they fit into these big commercial buildings that sit on top of them, and began to just play around with these spaces and create almost like a fantastical urban fabric that could be entirely made out of public space. Like, what if public space was just everywhere? And, honestly, with these protests this summer, it almost became a reality where the streets are closed because of COVID. People are out in the streets. Restaurants are now all outdoors. So in a way, it maybe isn't so fantastical now, even just a few short months after producing a drawing like this. So the second scale we decided to look at a little bit more, again, and kind of almost creating this project for ourselves, so it sort of turned into real work, was this neighborhood scale that I was talking about. And so we did this, again, very quick project, which was just a proposal, not yet a real building project. And we called it backlot urbanism. So a lot like those backyards I was telling you about. In this case, in a town called Newburgh, New York, which is in a way like a mini Detroit, has seen a lot of economic struggle in over the course of the 20th century. Large Black population in this city, and a condition where you have all of these backyards that in many times exist on these blocks where over the period of years, through abandonment of some of the homes, you know, disrepair of some of the properties, but also, you know, just families living all on the same block, there's a kind of, sometimes you'll have the same person or same people owning several buildings on the same lot. And we thought this was really interesting to where, okay, maybe in these backyards, you know, similar to the project I was showing you guys, could there be a way to almost begin to connect these properties in these backyards and have a kind of infrastructure that could serve these different houses, these different lots, but be connected somehow in the back lots. And again, this was a very quick series of drawings, which eventually a couple years later, in some ways started to become a reality where, you know, eventually by, you know, again, creating a network in this particular context, we were asked to actually work with an owner of several properties in this context who had purchased the properties that I show in red here, which are not all exactly together, but start to create this kind of a situation at the neighborhood scale, where you might have a way to begin to connect the lots that this person owns in some creative ways. And we just, you know, began to work on this building here, which is an old warehouse, and convert that from really a sort of empty shell now into an artist's workspace. And her ambitions are to begin to rehabilitate and to create some really interesting connections between these different properties. So again, a project that began as almost just a fantastical idea or you know, a proposal from our point of view, slowly you start to show that project to people, or you start to, you know, talk to people and put that idea out into the world. And it's funny how things end up actually becoming real projects when you do that, at least in our case. So the last project that I'm going to talk about is the domestic scale, and go a little bit more into detail into this idea of entering a competition now in this case, in order to leap up from, say, a competition for just a public art project or a public art pavilion into a project that's now really dealing with, you know, the life cycle of a neighborhood and the issues of a city, a larger amount of funding, many organizations coming together to actually create new ideas and a new prototype for a specific, in this case, neighborhood, but also a specific set of concerns that we now have as a society. So this project we call Side by Side, which is a kind of play on words because it's really two houses essentially side by side one another with a lot of funky stuff in between. But it was a response to this competition, which was called the Zero Threshold Competition for Barrier-Free Living. And it caught my eye for a few different reasons. One of them being that it was being put on by Cleveland, the city of Cleveland, which is very near where I'm originally from. If you remember my little Pechacucha, I'm from just south of Cleveland. But it also caught my eye because they were doing this competition really because they really believed that architecture could help to maybe not necessarily solve this problem of barrier-free living, or how handicapped folks or folks with accessibility concerns might live better or have new ways, new types of homes to live in. But I was really drawn to the fact that they felt that architecture was a huge part of this issue, and that getting ideas from a lot of different brilliant architectural minds, that Cleveland, this city, might be able to showcase some new prototypes and kind of move the conversation and the discourse on this a little bit through architecture, through design. So that caught our eye. We don't submit to all sorts of competitions, but we decided to submit to this one. Because we could talk a long time about submitting to competitions, but that's not the goal of this talk. And when you begin to dig into this issue, obviously something like handicapped accessibility has a lot of different facets to it, right? And it's really a human rights issue. And it's something that has been written into law and finds its way into our building codes that not all countries have. So something that we might take for granted, like ramps at the corner of our street, or a corridor being a certain amount of space wide enough for people to walk through if they can't see, if they're blind. These sorts of things really, I think, also connect to the rights of any marginalized population in the United States historically. So this small thing actually connects to issues of how a lot of different people might be isolated or brought together better through something like architecture. And then when you throw COVID into the mix, you've got a whole nother set of issues of how, okay, we started out, you might start off a project thinking, how can I create a design proposal that might, help to alleviate some of the problems that people in wheelchairs face. But you might end up finding out that that same project might also have to do with the fact that some of those same communities that struggle with elderly populations not having access to resources and those sorts of things also are being hit the hardest by something like COVID. So architecture is involved in all of these things. And then there's just the again, the accessibility of architecture in general. So in a way, we thought that we would take on this idea of accessibility on many different levels, and even think about, okay, how we represent, how we go about designing this project and presenting it to the community. We want to make even that as accessible as possible. Like how do you actually let people into your design process who might not be that familiar with what architects do or what developers do, but make it very, communicate very strongly and very easily to them what the intent is. So just to walk through this project, Cleveland, like similar to Detroit, similar to some other places, has a wide range of neighborhoods that have a lot of different degrees of income. The neighborhood that we were working in is down here on the bottom, if you can see my mouse, called Old Brooklyn. And it really was right in the middle, middle income, just kind of keeping up, and then also middle density. So again, similar to Newburgh, which we were looking at before, the scale of the city is really a neighborhood scale kind of neighborhood. Detached single and multifamily homes. And in a way, a kind of good level for us to sort of step up to as an architecture practice to think, okay, could we begin to operate at the scale of a building, maybe as a single or multifamily residential home. And this was, when you entered this competition, which you may enter one day, we were given a sort of list of potential sites that you could choose to propose your project on. And this became very critical to us because, again, thinking about these sites, we began to think about these sites, these lots, as different territories that might have potential to design this project. And immediately we were very intrigued by the two sites that were next to each other. So it got our wheels turning. Okay, what could you maybe do with two sites instead of just one site? You know, in some of these environments, not unlike Newburgh, where we were looking earlier, where you might have 2 or 3 sites that are empty or vacant, or somebody might own multiple sites. So we were very intrigued, and we decided to say, okay, let's try to think of a project that might work on a double site. And so that, by doing a little bit of research, we began to then just jump in and dive in. We had, you know, interns working in the office, and when you kind of start, you know, doing the design process for a competition, essentially you just begin to produce different schemes and options based on the different constraints. So this is just a process drawing that was made during this process pretty early on, where we began by just saying to ourselves, what are the basic constraints that we have to work with here in this territory, right, on these 2 lots. So if you look at the left, the shaded area are things called setbacks. So by law, you cannot build inside of those setbacks. So that's a setback is telling you how far back, or, you know, from side to side, one building has to be from another building. And so immediately, you know, the sort of urban planning starts to create a kind of territory that you can work in. But we decided, you know what, okay, let's kind of think about this, but maybe because of the particular situation in this city, and the city owns these lots, maybe we can still kind of play with this idea and almost, you know, break the rules a little bit, but in a provocative way. So we started to think of not just one house, but actually 2 houses side by side, and how they might work together to share territory was really the basic idea. And we made a lot of these quick schemes. So that's something I think in a competition is very helpful, is to sort of make different options, or in your design projects, if you get into school, you may not have the brilliant idea fall out of the sky. That's not usually how it happens, right? So, but you want to have a kind of, you might be working with a sort of general idea that you think you might be onto something, but there's a lot of different ways that idea might take built form. So our idea was like, okay, we have an idea about 2 houses next to each other, but we don't know if there's elevators in these houses. We don't know where the stairs go. They could go any number of ways. So we just tried a lot of different configurations, made very simple physical model study, like the one you see here. And I think this was one of our young people working in the office about your age, you know, made these 2 paper models, and we started to just play with them, and, you know, thought, okay, well, maybe there's something very interesting when you start to actually shear those 2 volumes apart from one another architecturally. So that became a sort of strong idea. And I just brought this slide to show that, you know, again, in the design process is often messy, and we just built very simple study models, this one out of foam, to think about these 2 kind of houses side by side. And so after several more iterations, this is really what we ended up with. And I think in many ways the project takes some of those ideas at the neighborhood scale, or even at the urban scale and the building scale, and tries to really work on those scales, those multiple scales in one project. So I made a few diagrams here just to unpack that a little bit more. So we decided to say, okay, maybe the jury, which actually we have a jury member in our midst of this competition. Maybe the jury, you know, who knows what they'll be interested in. But we're gonna try this, and we're not only gonna propose that we take 2 of these lots, but we're actually gonna propose that this other lot here on the left, if you see this one over here, we're going to break the rules in a good way, just a little bit more. And why wouldn't that make a great public space? You know, just like a lot of these other public spaces we've been talking about. What if this empty lot that's right next to this project became a public space for the community? It doesn't have to, but we're going to present our project with that idea. So that's where building this model with the sort of territory of the project, including that site, began to just have that as part of the project. If I keep going here. So in a way, those three lots kind of become one lot. And we thought to ourselves, you know, maybe the city could even give us what's called a variance of some kind to allow this project to really straddle those two lots in this special case. You know, you don't know, we didn't know if it would work, but we said this is a good enough idea that we could place this kind of middle zone, this sort of circulation space on this sort of setback area. And it's a strong enough idea that the city might go for it. They might say, yeah, you guys, we're gonna build this project, even though it's not exactly fitting into the setbacks that we had studied so carefully when we began to design the project. So this is a little like anecdotal of sometimes you want to really investigate what the rules are and then break them precisely to have a really interesting idea. And so right at that middle point, you know, again, we thought we have to put something right here that's gonna really pull these two buildings together. And so we decided for that to become really the center point of the house, which later you'll see became this vertical lift. So that became the kind of centerpiece of the project, which then also produced a sort of public space in the front, if you see that blue outline, and a more private yard in the back. So again, there's a lot of thinking about, okay, how do folks still have their private space if there's multiple families living in this project, which is the idea. And then how do we also maybe think about bringing some of the amenities of the city to this site? So if there's folks who are maybe elderly or don't get around so easily living at this project, maybe we can have the public come to them, was really the idea. And so that then we decided to put a lot of energy into really realizing this as a physical model that would sort of paint the picture of what this public space could be and what this project could be. So this is an image of that front public yard with some of these amenity spaces. They might be places to sit down and eat. They might be a bus stop, I think we proposed a new bus stop on the far left. Could be a garden and some of those other spaces, which really, in a sense, become just an extended front yard of this project. And so we, again, at the urban scale, we made some drawings which start to describe that a little bit more. And then at the neighborhood scale as well. So again, really now thinking about, okay, what was three discrete territories, discrete properties, is now really functioning as one system that has different aspects to it. So this idea of I live in my house, you know, with my family, you live in your house, and they're independent worlds, begins to become, well, maybe we live in this kind of multi-house, which is a sort of collection of different spaces and different units, like an apartment building, basically. And we even, you know, again, we really wanted to make this communicate to the community. So we got all of these little scale figures, even got a little bus that looked the closest to the Cleveland MTA bus that I remember from when I was living there. That would, again, almost make this seem like it was real in a way, to make it accessible, you know, and to really think about, okay, we don't always, you know, a lot of times we don't have people in wheelchairs in the images that we make. So they're even on that level of who are you putting into the images, the drawings that you're making, became part of this proposal, this project, and this competition. And so then the back, we decided to, take something like, again, your backyard and use that as a design opportunity. So we thought a while about that, and then we said, well, okay, what is something that is usually something really annoying that architects complain about having to make because of handicapped accessibility? And one of them are these really super long ramps that when you get into your design, curriculum, you'll find that they have a lot of different rules. There's a very specific amount of we call it rise to run, or the sort of steepness that a ramp can have, and it's very tightly controlled, and it produces these very long ramps. So we thought, why don't we make that into an amazing garden space? So again, something that's normally a very sort of difficult thing for architects or contractors to integrate into a building project, we said, you know what? There's got to be a way to do this that everyone would enjoy this, and it would be a beautiful thing. So we just made the whole backyard into that ramp. And this is, some of the ideas here are coming from the history of architecture. So but the history of architecture often is filled with very rich people's houses. So this was a project that some of you might know soon, but it's called the Maison Bordeaux. It's a very famous house that was built for a very wealthy handicapped person. And as one of the features is this kind of sunken courtyard and this vertical 3-part layering to the house that in this case is being enjoyed by really the primary owner of this space, who again is clearly a very wealthy individual. So we thought, how can we, and this is how we think a lot, how can we do something that's as cool as this for people who don't have tons of money, who just want a cool space and happen to be in a wheelchair or happen to be blind or whatever. And to spoiler alert a little bit, when we won the competition, one of the things that some of the community members said was, we really like that you created a project that was vertical, because a lot of times for people with wheelchairs or with handicapped disabilities, we always get told to live in these kind of ranch style homes, like on one level, but that they appreciated, and maybe Justin can speak to this, but they appreciated that we were proposing something that was kind of like a celebration of how a lot of people live, with a big vertical house where you can go up into different spaces. You have double height spaces, and it's a kind of house that we take for granted, but that some people actually don't often have the opportunity to live this way because of certain constraints. So this was again, using this physical model, an image that we made to really communicate all of the different spaces and different people that could fit into this house. And I just brought this to again show that we were thinking about the flexibility that you can have to sort of sculpt and carve all of these spaces with the stick frame construction. So again, thinking really even back to these other projects that I was showing you, this was an experience that I had as a graduate student to build a house with some community members and my classmates. And I think those experiences were still with me when I was thinking about, okay, how do we begin to carve out the different spaces of this house? So just know that when you're in school, you're going to have experiences. You're going to be in a class and you're going to see something and you're going to remember it 20 years later or 10 years later. And you're not even going to realize you remembered it, but it's going to come back and you'll be like, okay, yeah, remember when I did that thing? Well, I could do that here. So again, this is looking at the section cut through the house. And we just proposed to have almost like an industrial lift, but really just a kind of vertical electronic lift be, again, the heart of the house, and that you could travel up through and becomes almost like a part of the social space. And then we decided to take that model apart and show people the inside. So beginning at the bottom level, it's really an open common space. So a common basement kitchen where you could like have different classes and things. And then as you work your way up, again, there's just this side-by-side mixing of different sorts of units for both families and single people, which actually started to suggest even a kind of financial arrangement that you could have here. For example, everybody living side by side. So you might have, if I get a little further ahead here, you might have, you know, even a young person just out of college living in a 1-bedroom apartment in the back, and they might be able to get a grant to live in this house for free because they're helping, you know, maybe 2 of the elderly residents of the house with cook their meals or giving them in-home care of some kind. So there's, again, through the architecture, an idea about how we might actually support one another in the kind of housing living situation. And, you know, we're seeing some of this stuff. We're seeing architecture be invoked by initiatives, you know, at the highest level, like the Green New Deal, where they're saying, you know, in the Green New Deal proposal, which has to do with the, you know, all sorts of things like the environment, the climate crisis, listed in that very important piece of proposed legislation are things like access to affordable, safe, adequate housing. And, you know, statements like this, that we need to direct investment to diversify industry and local and regional economies to build wealth and community ownership while prioritizing high quality job creation, that support frontline communities. I keep going, et cetera, et cetera. And even in these, in, you know, the sort of lists of demands by some of these activist initiatives, architecture or housing for everyone is really one of the really important necessities for a large part of the kind of social movements that are working to kind of improve society on many fronts. And I just wanted to bring that back, that again, something like a prototype for living can be really part of, you know, a much bigger picture. That architecture is part of one of the pieces of that puzzle. And so, like I said, we even began to think about how this project might relate to COVID, which has restarted some interest in the proposal because we won and they want to build it. And we said, well, hey, there's actually an aspect to this which might even begin to suggest, you know, some other ways of, you know, some safer kind of ways of approaching even something like COVID, where you might have some either in-house healthcare being part of this proposal, or the house itself might be able to be divided up into a series of clusters that could allow for maybe more safe quarantine environments. So something that began as a project that is looking primarily at kind of shared territory in the context of collective living is now actually offering some ideas as to how, you know, you might be able to have sort of safer quarantine sort of clusters in a sort of collective living situation. And so these are just some examples of those different individuals that might live side by side in this proposal, with those common spaces being the kind of critical component of this project. That, you know, sure, it's essentially two homes put next to one another, but the critical connective tissue takes little steps to actually produce a very different kind of project. Where, for example, in that yellow zone, We've taken the kitchens out of some of these units and actually put a sort of more communal kitchen in that central zone of the house. And then of course added lots of outdoor green space not only up on the second floor, but on the top of the house. So, you know, in this case, you know, wouldn't it be nice to be able to retreat even during something like COVID up to an outdoor garden space where you could, you know, more safely maybe just get some fresh air and kind of have some garden space and maybe even meet with other folks in a much more kind of open air environment. And so I'll just close with some final images of that project. Like I said, the jury were excited about the idea, and we're in talks now to hopefully construct this project, which this phase that I'm showing you is really just the first step of something like this. It's the concept design, which I think is a really important step. But from here would enter the schematic design phase, and then a period of construction documentation. And finally, to begin construction and then enter the construction administration phase. But our construction administration phase looked like this. And I just give you some outtakes here of kind of what it took to build this model. But I think also, I remember why I always put this image in here, which was working with the actual, these little scale figures at this stage of the process really forced me and forced us to think about the body moving through the space. And I think that's really important for you guys never to forget that, you know, we deal with actual bodies moving through actual space. And sometimes that can become very abstracted in our discipline, including by myself. But it's always a good reminder that we're building these things for actual people to actually live in. This is the mess of my office when we were making this, but just showing you guys a little bit of my office space. These were the young people I had working with me to do the project. So they had all the good ideas. I wasn't the only one having the good ideas. And now this is just to show you, now my office is over Zoom. So some of those same young people I'm working with in digital space, but we found ways to do it just like I'm doing with you guys right now. And that's it. I hope I didn't go too far over. But thank you.
That was fine. Thank you. So I had
Deeper dive.
Yeah, I had asked people to maybe provide a few questions. I don't know if you saw that, but there's a couple in the chat. One is asking, what was the most challenging part of starting your company, and how did you get through it? And there's another one that asks, how many places have you done projects?
Yes, I just am now seeing the chat. That's always a hard thing. It's hard to look at the chat and share a screen at the same time.
Yeah, no problem.
Most challenging part of starting the company, I would say everything. You know, I would say the most challenging part would be, honestly having the confidence to do it. I think in some ways that was one of the more challenging parts. I know that sounds a little bit woo-woo, but I think a lot of that, the challenge is kind of mental, and beginning to undertake something like that. But also, you know, very pragmatically, I'm not independently wealthy. So beginning to carve out the sort of financial agency and space to get a few clients to kind of support the practice, I think is one of the most difficult things for a young practice, is finding clients and finding a sort of space to occupy that will provide a little bit of traction to begin to get more clients and more projects. I think that can be very difficult and is difficult. Also, building those early projects was extremely difficult in New York City. I think it was really helpful for my practice because it, again, was sort of real and affected real people. And I think that there was some agency in that, but that was very difficult to do while I was working for other people. Someone's asking me, how many places have you done a project? That list is growing. I'd say most of the projects that I work on in my practice are either in New York City or beginning to be in the greater New York region. Something like the project that I finished on, Side by Side, is a competition proposal for other cities, which I've entered several of those. We just did a competition for a watchtower in Latvia, in another country. So, we play around. Sometimes you're invited to do things. We were invited to propose a project for a college in Virginia. But in general, the most work has been coming, at least in the way that I've set up my practice, from sort of almost word of mouth in my local community. So in Harlem, in the Bronx, in Manhattan, in Queens, in New Jersey, within an hour's drive of our office is where a lot of the work has come. But I think we're beginning to branch out and even think of something like the project I showed you. We've had interest from places like Arizona to build a project like that, places closer to New York. So it's almost like a prototype that could be in different places. Any other questions?
Yeah, there's some in the chat.
Okay.
And students can ask on camera too. You can talk.
Yeah.
I see one. Do you think changing the way spaces are defined will always change the way the space is viewed? Not quite sure what that one means.
Alyssa,
yeah, Alyssa, what do you mean by
that?
So when he was talking, he was saying a lot about like challenging public and private spaces. So do you think like if you mix them up, it's going to definitely change the way a space is viewed?
Over time, yeah. If I understand what you're saying, I think that we, the larger public, and Justin and Rod would have plenty to say about this. We do, and even different, I think it changes a lot even from one city to another, how people view like public space. So in a place like New York City, one of the bigger things that has happened recently is the fact that these restaurants are now taking over the parking spaces in front of their building to have like basically open dining and open party space of a certain kind. And that has really changed, I think, how New Yorkers will view public space for a while. So that kind of definition of, oh, this is now public space has had an effect, I think, on how people think about the city, yeah. But it can take a long time, and I think it can differ from place to place. I don't know how the others feel about that.
Yeah, I would jump in with two different responses to that, and to use the last project that Jerome shared, where he was talking about designing more inclusive spaces, right? And so by changing the way that we define what an inclusive space is and what it looks like absolutely can change how people view and use a space. So for those of you kind of going into the architecture path, you'll learn about the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that the way that you make a space inclusive is you design it however you want, and then you go and you make a ramp, right? Or you make some kind of access for people that aren't kind of what we call able-bodied people. And so that's how many architects have operated for a long time, that was the definition of accessibility, was to kind of provide a separate but equal kind of approach for how people are accessing the space. And like, this is something that was like dominant in architects' work, was to create separate but equal access to space. And so, changing the definition of what it means to have an accessible space is what a lot of architects are now sort of reckoning with, right? ADA is about 30 years old, and people are acknowledging, it's terrible that, if you're with your family and someone happens to be in a wheelchair, or someone has a stroller, right? They have to go around to the side and have a totally different experience from everyone else. And that definition of what do we mean when we say we're creating accessible spaces absolutely changes kind of how we practice, how we define that. And then as we start building that, right, architects and builders are making ideas real, right? So as we start building that idea for what accessibility is in a different way, it absolutely changes how people use and view and utilize spaces. And the same definitely goes for things like kind of public space, more urban design type things where, if you've got a public space and there's nowhere to sit, right, then people aren't going to see that as a space that they can linger and occupy in, right? Very simple act, putting a chair, right? Then people see that space differently, they view that space differently, and then they use it differently, right? Or a space that has lighting, designed in a certain way may make people see and view that space differently. So absolutely, that idea of architects and designers and builders being people that help us define spaces is part of what we do, right? That's in theory, like you do that and you have experience and skills and technical knowledge, and that's what people are literally paying you to do.
Right. Yes, and that's kind of what. Oh, go ahead, Rod.
Oh, just quickly, just to piggyback on that, I think that oftentimes with public space, if the space isn't like used, people don't see it. Like it's almost like it's invisible until until designers or someone sees what that potential could be. And it's not like you have to, design everything or prescribe everything. I think if you just, like you say, just light it up, or cut the grass, and clean off all the trash, or repair the sidewalk, all of a sudden, people see maybe a potential there, and then they're able to use their own agency to kind of, make it relevant for them.
Yes, and that's kind of what, like Justin was also saying, as architects, when you're answering a design brief from a client or from a competition, in a way that is what we're called to do, I think it almost as an imperative, is to really try to expand the understanding of what some of these things can be. That's maybe even one of the highest sort of aspirations of what architects can offer, is a new way of seeing the world, or seeing a type of building or a problem from a different perspective. Yeah.
I saw I think we missed one. Did we miss times you thought this wasn't the right choice?
Yes, I saw that one.
What does that mean? This like being an architect, or this like something about a particular project? Could you clarify that? I think it's Jared. While Jared's doing that, we've got a couple other that came in that you might be more ready to.
Yeah. I think Jared's saying, are you times you thought this wasn't the right choice? I assume he means architecture.
Starting the company. Right.
Or starting the company.
Yeah, he said the company.
That's a good question. Ask me in a couple years. It's funny. Like, I think, careers are always evolving and changing. So I felt like it was definitely, I don't regret making that step into a different sort of level or a different step of my career. I think it's been hard. I think you have to reinvent yourself when you own your own business on even a yearly basis. So I'm doing things differently now than I was a year ago, and I was doing things differently 2 years ago than I was 1 year ago. But I don't really regret it. I really, it's a lot of work, but I enjoy, in a way, being able to try to run a practice and make a difference in that way. Will I do it forever? Not sure. I may not run my own practice forever, but for the time being, I'm enjoying it. It's a labor of love, but it's difficult, and it's not for everybody. That's for damn sure.
It's not. Yeah, I will never do that. I don't like answering the phone. And like, if you have your own business, somebody's got to answer the phone.
Ooh, yeah. No, it's a lot.
It seems like there's a related question there about how did you manage your time when you started the business versus kind of what's the day-to-day now? Like,
yeah, that's a good one. I think, I think you have to really, at a certain point, and I learned this from observing, I think, my boss when I was working at my firm, you have to learn how to delegate control of things to other people. And I'd say that I'm getting better at that, and managing, managing more of my time is spent delegating now than it is actually like producing drawings. And so that has been a bit of a change from when we first started. It really was just the two of us kind of clicking away, producing everything. And at a certain point, if you're going to run your own business, I believe you have to shift over and learn how to delegate some of that model out to other folks to do, while you then move on to trying to run the business at a higher level. So I'd say more of my time now is spent delegating than it is kind of maybe doing the actual drawing. But sometimes it depends, and honestly, and COVID has also thrown in a whole other curveball into how I work and how my day is spent, and same as all of you guys. So now my day is spent on Zooms, doing any number of things, and I'm working remotely with people who might be working for me. So that's been a big difference as well.
One thing I'll add is that something that a lot of firms do is they're starting their own practice. So, hang your own shingle. You end up, unless you've got a huge client or something, you end up having to kind of do lots of different kinds of work. So Jerome, for example, also teaches, right? And so that's a way to kind of supplement income and livelihood, frankly, while you're building out your practice. Others will do consulting. They have their own firm, but then they'll still do consulting work for a former firm that they used to work for, or work on different kinds of projects just to sort of keep things going while they build their practice. A lot of time that people end up spending when they're starting an office is networking, right? They're just trying to get projects and work
So much
in.
time.
And so like it takes, you know, it's not like you're selling somebody, you know, beauty products or a car, right? It's like they're going to spend millions of dollars, right? And so like that's a relationship that's not just, oh, hey, I'm an architect, and we're like, okay, here you go. That's not how that goes. It's building relationships and kind of finding the spaces and finding opportunities. And so you'll notice like a lot of the work that Jerome showed was kind of smaller scale projects and work, because you have to build your brand and you have to build trust that you can do a certain scale of project, and that takes years sometimes. And so, you know, the former Fermions was doing like these huge multi-million-dollar projects and huge master plans. Well, when you go off, you're not necessarily able to immediately continue doing that work. You'll have to kind of start building your own networks and practices.
Yes, absolutely.
Maybe if we could, there's one, maybe we can close out with this one, if you don't mind. Cassandra's asking if you wanted to bring DMU and Black spaces to a smaller community, would you? And what would be the process? And how do you go about picking the perfect work site?
Yeah, yes, you know, DMU and Black spaces are maybe, you know, subsets of the same thing. But you know, I tried to weave in a little bit into this presentation. I didn't have time to get into it too much, to some very kind of deep embedded Black spaces that I've sort of had my practice span from some of the teaching, which would also involve DMU, into real world scenarios. So for example, working very closely with this community group, trying to create a living memorial or a living interpretive center at a local African burial ground site has been a really rewarding process, and really challenging even what a community space is, from a sort of really from a Black space sort of perspective, and kind of producing a new kind of Black space in that context. And I think with you know, with something like DMU, I think DMU is very in line with the idea that, you know, we might be in a class teaching, but there's also the broader community, and how can we bridge those worlds a little bit? So we definitely have ideas with something like DMU to do projects that might involve student and community members collaborating on even built work. So yes, that's a great question, and I hope that in my practice I begin to do more of work that blends all those worlds together.
Right. Yeah, I'll just add, I just put in the chat a link to the Jerome shared some work in Kingston, and this is the organization African Burial Ground Project with Harambe. And this is in a smaller community. This is in New York City or Harlem. This is in a small community, upstate New York, kind of not on the radar typically. But I think the idea behind what we're trying to do is that all sorts of communities, and especially Black communities, deserve good design and design thought, and understanding that this is an expertise that can help improve communities, and that's not bound by kind of just wealth or geography, right? And so, you know, Jerome is someone that is already doing that work in communities that aren't, you know, New York, Chicago, Atlanta, right? Like kind of other geographies that have Black communities, Black spaces. Yeah, we're starting that process and growing it.
Yeah, and those communities, you know, they really need more visibility too. Even, you know, in New York City, people don't even think of the area north of New York City as a Black space, but it is very much. And there's a long history there of free and enslaved Africans that have been there from the beginning. So there's not enough folks and architects kind of working in that space, I think.
Great. Well, thank you, Jerome.
Thank you guys. This was fun.
Yeah, thank
Hopefully
you.
you learned something.
Thanks to each of you. Yes, and I think I believe next week is Vanessa. I
Vanessa,
believe?
yes. So
Yes.
yes, so next week is Vanessa Isaiah, and she's kind of architect and also has her own practice now, but has kind of a broader career doing things like affordable housing design, but has now also started her own firm. So we're excited to have her. And she'll also speak to things like kind of getting into the field and licensure and kind of all the kind of more technical sides of design practice.
Great, great. Well, thanks again. And just as a reminder, so class, remember your reflective assignments are due Wednesday. So I don't have a portal there as yet, but I'll be creating it for you and I'll send an email out probably around midday tomorrow. So usually after tomorrow, midday, you should be able to upload those and we'll be taking a look. So thank you for completing those for us. All right. And if there's nothing else, we'll just say so long till next time. Take care.
All right, see you next week.
All right.
You guys, take care.